thanks everybody for joining. We're just waiting a couple more minutes until we have some more folks join, and then we'll start the webinar. So just hang tight and we'll get started shortly. Welcome everybody that just joined us. We're just waiting a couple more minutes until some more folks arrive, and then we'll get started. Thanks so much for coming, and we'll start the webinar shortly. All right, I think we can probably get started, and I think folks will probably continue to join us in the next couple minutes, but that's okay. So welcome to the webinar. My name is Lauren Clark, and I'm the Energy Projects Coordinator for EOS Eco-Energy. EOS is an environmental nonprofit in Sackville, New Brunswick, and we promote renewable energy and climate change awareness, and we monitor water quality of local watersheds. And this is our 9th annual Climate Change Week celebration. And just want to welcome everybody to the Vermiculture Webinar. I'm super excited for this webinar. We have 3 really awesome guest speakers that I'm excited to introduce to you guys. Just before that, I'm just going to say the webinar is being recorded, so hopefully that's okay with you, and if not, for sure let me know, but just to let you know. The other thing I'll say is try and keep yourself on mute during the presentation, but certainly in the discussion period and definitely during question and answer, it would be great to hear from you folks that have questions. So feel free to unmute during that time. If you have any questions that come up during the presentation section, definitely type them into the chat box just so you don't forget, or keep them in mind until afterwards. And I think we can get started. So I'll ask the presenters to introduce themselves in any order that you like. And thanks so much.
Well, I'll start. I'm John Castell. I'm a Master Composter, Master Gardener, PhD, and very involved with gardening, schools, garden clubs, community gardens, and all that sort of thing.
I'll go next. My name is Michelle Strain. I'm the Director of Administrative Services at Mount Allison University. I run all the business operations on campus. And one of those operations is the dining hall. So I've come to composting in a big way. We have 2 big Swedish big hennas at the back of the dining hall that compost all of the food waste that we have there. But was always interested in a home version, and worms seem to be the way to go. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Michelle.
Hey folks, I'm Michael Freeman. I'm a landscape designer and home gardener in Sackville, New Brunswick, and a big worm lover and a major champion of the zero-cost composting system.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Okay, so now what I'm going to do, John has a PowerPoint presentation that he has, so I'm going to share that on my screen. and we're going to go through that. So just give me 1 second. See if we can get it to cooperate. Welcome for folks who are just joining us. Just trying to see. There we go. You just have to hold your mouth the right way. All right.
Okay.
And sorry, John, you go ahead. I'm just going to figure out how to share.
Okay, it's on the screen here. I think everybody should be able to see it.
Yeah. Is that better?
Yeah, that's good. That's
perfect.
The first slide. I just like to introduce a little humor, especially when I'm talking to the elementary kids at the school. So a little picture of worm to say we're into vermiculture. Do you have the ability to move slides forward?
Yes, I do, John.
Okay.
So you just let me know when you want me to move them forward.
Okay.
And
a hand up like that, or just say next slide?
Next slide, I think is good. Yeah.
Okay. The California red wiggler is what most people use for vermiculture. They consume organic matter, digest it, extract the food value, and expel a residue called worm castings, which we might call worm poop. It's rich in nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, organic matter, and also most of the essential trace elements. Red wigglers are rapid multipliers and break down compost more quickly than any of the other worms. They're under ideal conditions, they can eat 1.5 to 2 times, or 1.5 to 1 times their body weight per day. Next slide. It's interesting that you might know that a bunch of worms like the ones in the hand is called a swarm of worms, like a murder of crow or a pod of whales. Each worm has 5 hearts, interesting fact, and that worms can live up to 10 years. Next slide. I always like to quickly introduce reasons why it's good to compost, including with the worms. You reduce the organic waste that goes to the landfill. Up to 30% of the home garbage going to the landfill is organic waste that can be used in compost. Next slide. It's easy once your worm bin's established. You just add material to the ongoing compost. It's important that you put the added food material below the surface of the compost. Otherwise, you'll get fruit flies and mold growing on it. Everybody can participate. It also means less waste going to the landfill, less weight in trucks, so reduces the use of fuel. Next slide. And also the best part of it is great for your garden. The compost helps to retain moisture in the garden and reduce the need for watering, and it's also provides rich material for the garden to get beautiful vegetables or fruit trees or whatever. Next slide. It also reduces if you have the nice organic compost that you get from the worms, you don't need to add chemical fertilizers. One of the problems with chemical fertilizers, they're water soluble. They tend to go into the water table and then into the rivers and streams and cause eutrophication, like you can see in the little picture on the right. Next slide. Am I talking too fast?
No, I think it's great, John.
Okay. Now, there are probably hundreds of commercial vermiculture setups that you can purchase from anywhere to $100 up to thousands of dollars. But I like the inexpensive ones that you can set up in the classroom or at home, where you just use a plastic tote bin, like you can see these class that are setting up a composter in the outdoors there. And So you need to have holes either in the top or in the side because worms require oxygen. They also require some moisture, but too much water will drown them. So they need the air to breathe. So in my case, I put holes in the top so they don't crawl up the side and out through the holes on the side. But if you're outdoors, holes in the top, the rain may get through and drown your worms. The moisture is necessary. Okay, we're back. You
Sorry,
can
John.
cover if it's outside, you can cover it to conserve the moisture. The worms don't like light. And that's an advantage when you want to harvest the compost, and I'll talk about that later. So you can do it indoors or outdoors, but the worms don't like freezing temperatures, and the California red wigglers will die in freezing. At least that's, I don't put them outside, but that's what I've been told in all of the learning I've had about composting and vermiculture. Next slide. So if you're going to start an inexpensive compost at home in your plastic hoop bin, you want the carbon source, and a good carbon source is shredded paper, or you can have shredded newspaper like Isabel is preparing. Next slide. She's putting it in. She's using also leaves, which are fine. The leaves would be better if you were able to mulch them. The smaller the particles, the more easy it is for the worms to eat them. It also is good. Peat moss is good because it holds the moisture, but it doesn't get drippy wet so that it doesn't dry too fast. And so adding peat moss is good for the worms. Next slide. You also want to add sand because the worms need the sand in their gullet the same way as the birds, like your chickens and so on, need to eat little pebbles because they don't have teeth, and it helps to break down the organic matter so they can digest it in the intestinal tract. And it's also good to add soil, as the soil contains the bacteria that are critical to help break down the food in the composter and help for the worms to digest the food once they've consumed it. As with us, most of the digestion is done in our intestinal tracts by the bacteria that are there, in addition to the enzymes that we and the worms secrete. Next slide. So you get it all mixed together. You add water, but only enough that it feels wet when you pick it up. You don't want it so wet that when you pick it up and squeeze it, the water drains out. Next slide. So once you've got the sand, the soil, the shredded paper, and the peat moss or shredded leaves or other organic matter that'll help to retain the moisture, then you add about 500 or a squirm of worms to the top. The worms very quickly will disappear, and that's always amazes the kids in the elementary class because we put hundreds of worms on the top of it, and they all love to have them in their hands and play with them a little bit and then put them in, and they will disappear down into the material that you put together and mixed. Next slide. So you can add vegetables, fruit, coffee grinds, tea bags, eggshells. You don't want to add meat, fish, dairy products because they will smell. And if you do it right, the compost will be smelling nice, humusy smell. If it starts to stink, you've got too much food in it, and the worms can't eat it that fast. Next slide. So what you want to do, this is just the very beginning, that you want to open up a space in a corner of the bin and add your organic matter, your eggshells, your fruit, and your vegetable material in, and then cover it over with the material. She hasn't mixed that very well. With my class and my group, I like to have this paper and soil and the peat moss and everything else a lot more mixed than it is in this one. I should have used my own pictures from my own setup maybe. So it's simple and easy. Next slide. Be sure the food's covered with the bedding material. Exposed food can encourage fruit flies. It may also get moldy. You may even start having little mushrooms going on it. So it should be underneath the compostable material or the peat moss and the bedding material that you have to start with. Next slide. So what you might want to do is have some little marker to mark where you add the food and move to a different corner of the bin each week so that the worms will be working and eating up the food that's in one corner. By the time you come back a month later to the corner where you started, you'll find that it's all just nice black compost material or worm castings. So you can start adding back in the corner. So you don't want always to add it in the same place because it'll be overburdened with organic matter that you're adding. Next slide. And after 3 to 4 months, it'll look mostly like compost. You can still see some undigested food that's there, but that's mostly good compost that you can then harvest and put in your house plants or put out in your garden. And in order to harvest the compost, what you do is dump it in a pile, allow it to be exposed to bright light like the sun outside or bright light inside. After half an hour or to an hour, all the worms will tend to be going to the bottom, and you can take a spatula or a garden spade and sort off and collect the compost material, put it in a bin. You can save the organic matter to add back to the compost, and you'll get down to, next slide. In the middle at the bottom of the pile of compostable material, you'll find a big squirm of worms as you have there. You can use those. After 3 months, you probably have enough that you can share with 3 other people and start 3 compost bins going. Next slide. You also can stack and have 2 or 3 or 4 in stacks where you add to the top and the material goes down. It's good to have holes in the bottom of the bin and something to collect it in, because the worms excrete liquids like we do. That comes out and goes through the compost material and makes a beautiful compost tea that's lovely to add to fertilize your bedding plants, your potted flowers, or in the garden. And you can inexpensively set up a fairly complex big setup like you see in this picture.
John, I have a question.
Yes.
A couple people are wondering, and I think this is a good time to bring it up because these are sort of larger bins. Somebody was wondering about the amount of worms and if it depends on the size of the bin that you're going to put them in, I guess.
Yeah, they will grow to fit the size of the bin you're in. Once they get too crowded, they'll stop reproducing so quickly.
Okay, so it'd be okay if you started with so the number you start with is maybe not so important. You need to start with a certain number, but yeah,
about 500 worms to start with, but you could put 2,000 in if you want, or you can put probably 100 in. The thing is, you want enough they're going to start eating the food that you want to add.
Gotcha.
And you want the size of your compost bin to be approximately what'll easily handle your kitchen surplus that you have. Unless you're going around to the restaurants and collecting the kitchen scraps from all the restaurants, so then you need a much bigger setup.
Gotcha. Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. You can keep going. Just thought I'd interject with that question.
Yeah, that's good. I'd like to have questions and being interrupted anytime while I'm talking. I find a dialogue with the people I'm talking to is much better than just talking on. I get sick of hearing my own voice sometimes. Okay, let's go to the next slide.
Do
you have a question?
Compost?
For sure.
Yeah. A question about the tea compost.
Yes.
I think you have to dilute it, do you? How much would you have to dilute it?
Well, I put some of it right on the surface, and then I dilute it with water as I water the plant. But
Okay.
it's
Okay.
what comes out of that is not going to hurt your plant or your flowers and things.
Okay. Okay. Good. Thanks.
But you can dilute it down as much as 1 to 10.
Okay.
It's still going to, the nutrients still going to be there. It'll stay in your soil. You're going to add enough to water the plants. I don't think it's super critical.
Okay, thanks.
Next slide.
Just, sorry, John, just while we're on this slide, someone was just wondering about the stacked bins, and they're wondering, in the space where there's 3 stacked bins, are there holes in the bottom of
Yes,
each
in
bin?
all cases, there's holes in all the bottoms except the very bottom.
Okay. So the compost material, would it stay in the middle, or would it go down? Or
I have the smaller holes in the one closest to the bottom, so that it's only water going out of that one.
Gotcha.
If I have a second or third one, then I have bigger holes so that some of the compost material will drop through to the second one or the third one, but not to the one where you want to collect the compost tea from.
Okay, gotcha. So you just want liquid in the very bottom and then the material. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that makes sense. Gotcha. Thanks so much.
I learned my lesson about the compost tea with the first vermiculture I set up. It was going so well that I was getting a lot of water produced, and I ended up drowning worms in the bottom of it because I didn't have holes in the bottom. So
okay. So it's trial and error, sort of.
Yeah, you'll learn as you go. The worms are going to teach you most everything you need to know.
Good. That's great.
Okay,
Thanks.
next slide. This is just a diagram to show you that there's bigger holes, smaller holes, and that the top one has got your bedding material. And then as it breaks down, the worm castings will drop through into the second bin, and the water will drop through to the third bin that you can then tap off and use for fertilizing and watering your plants. Okay. Then there are, now, like I say, I believe there are probably hundreds of different versions of commercial setups. When I had this picture first, the setup on the left was $400, and the setup on the right was about $450 or $500. Although I don't see much difference except for the color. Next slide. I'm sort of ready for questions. That's a real quick introduction to vermiculture. But I do have some questions. If there weren't any, there are questions that I can't answer that have been asked before.
For sure. There are some questions. So maybe I'll go to those, and then I think it would be good. I was just thinking with that one slide where there were some options, if we show Michelle's version, but there were some questions about tea bags, and Michael and John and Michelle, feel free to jump in. A couple of people were wondering about tea bags. So someone said, for tea bags, do you cut it open and get the tea leaves out? They said, I think some tea bags are nylon or plastic, or some paper. Any insights about tea bags?
Yeah, that's quite correct. A lot of the tea bags are made with a synthetic fiber that doesn't break down. If they're sort of paper mesh tea bags, the worms will be able to eat those too. But I do open them up, and if they're the paper type mesh paper, then I can add them in the compost. Otherwise, I just dump the tea in. Same with a number of the little coffee pods that are supposed to be compostable. I found that even after a year, they haven't broken down, and I dump the coffee out and throw out the little pod.
Just a thing to kick in, if I may, and like, you know, for tea bags, leaves, or kitchen scraps, really anything you're including in a worm compost system, or even like a hot compost system or a cold compost system outside in the bin, shredding is super critical. John alluded to this, but increasing the amount of surface area helps things to break down more quickly. So yeah, with fruit peels, tea bags, anything, you know, you can shred it, you can chop it on your cutting board.
Yes.
The successful systems that I've seen, they recommend, you know, nothing larger in thickness or surface area than the size of a loonie as a good rule of thumb.
Yeah, mostly the smaller the better. Bigger things, you know, if you're just peeling an apple, the apple peel, the worms will eventually break it all down, but they can break it down a lot faster if you chop it up first. So I have a cutting board and a nice butcher's knife, and I chop everything down to where it's about 1/8 of an inch in all dimensions, or approximately.
Awesome. I think this might be a good time. I don't know, Michelle, do you mind talking to us briefly about how that works for the big Hannahs at Mount A? I know when you spoke to me about that, I found that super interesting. So if you don't mind, just sort of how that works on a larger scale in like an industrial sort of setting.
Oh, sure. So we use pre-compost, pre-consumer and post-consumer waste at Jennings. So in the kitchen waste goes in a bin and that goes into the composters. The students who eat at the dining hall, we have a scraping station, and so they scrape their food waste. The only things that don't go in are the bones. So if you have steak, well, we don't have steak that often, but any kind of chicken bones or beef bones or pork chop bones, stuff that doesn't go in. So they scrape it. Then it goes down, just as John and Michael were talking about, we break it down in a what we call a pulper. So it's broken down, it's a huge grinder. It grinds all the food waste down to about the size of a dried piece of rice. And so that goes in, that is the nitrogen that goes into the big in-vessel composters. So we load in about 120 kilograms for each composter per day of food waste. So the nitrogen, the carbon source that we use there is wood pellets. And so the ratio for wood pellets to food waste is 1 bucket. We have it measured, it's a bucket, 1 bucket of wood pellets to 3 buckets of food waste. And so oxygen and water, of course, are the other 2 important elements. So it rotates every 2 hours for about 2 minutes. And so from start to finish, it's about 6 to 7 weeks, depending on the heat. So it just rolls around day after day. And so the compost, it looks like food waste at the beginning, and then by the time it gets to the end chute and comes out into big wheelbarrows, it's very brown. It looks like coffee grinds, and it's about 95% ready to put into the ground when it comes out. So it's a very efficient system. We bought them, well, we did a lot of research, of course, but the big Hannah technology is what we chose for Mount Allison. It basically can compost all of the food waste in that facility. So 1,000 students eating 3 times or 4 times a day. And they're not, with our scraping station, students are very conscious. So you're scraping your own waste, and so students will tend not to take too much. They'll eat what they put on their plates, so there isn't that much to scrape in, but you still have banana peels, you still have apple cores, and you know, all that kind of stuff that gets scraped in. So yeah, and the big Hannahs will take everything, rice, any citrus, anything that gets dropped in. So orange peels, where worms don't tend to like a lot of citrus. So worms are a little bit different. They're a little bit more needy of attention than the big cannas. The big cannas just turn on this 2 horsepower motor all day, all night, and then we dump it into a trailer and take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Yeah, I just thought we would do that little side beer just because I think that's super interesting how that works. I do see some questions, and we will get to those questions. I'm wondering, Michael, if you want to go ahead and sort of talk about your experience with worms and your setup and how that's all gone, and yeah, your methods.
Sure. So, and I'll preface just by saying, like, worms are available. Please, people, get at me if you want worms. My current setup, I started from a yogurt container full of worms, which is what I'd be happy to share with you. And you feed them gradually and get up to, I have at this point 5 20-gallon bins. They were all curb scored, which I love, but you can go out and buy a Rubbermaid bin if you have to. I haven't bothered with drainage holes. I don't really draw off a whole lot of liquid for moisture control. I just incorporate more brown matter. And if you keep the consistency, the level of moisture about the texture of, I like to think of like a nice moist cake, you know, kind of crummy, like the texture of good humus, right? That's what we're going for here. And so I've never bothered drawing off tea or that kind of thing. If I see any standing liquid, I'll just mix a couple of handfuls of leaves in there, shred them up with my hands. Pretty simple. In terms of, and this speaks a little bit to, I saw some questions about like, how often do you have to harvest these things? They're pretty flexible. I mean, worms love living in their own poop as long as there's some stuff for them to eat. You can neglect them for a little while. It's probably safer to do that than to overfeed. But I use my compost for 2 things, and I'll handle it differently for either. So I use it in the spring when I'm starting seedlings. And so not at the germination stage, but once I'm potting up my tomato plants, for example, or flowers, what have you, annuals, perennials, I will screen out some compost just to try to get some of the big, less decomposed chunks out, mix it 50-50 with some Pro Mix, and it's great for maturing seedlings. And the other thing I love using worm compost for, as opposed to like bagged compost from the store, is for prepping my garden beds. And I don't bother removing the worms at all because worms are a great part of natural soil structure. They're great at stimulating soil biology. And so my approach is I'll get a bed weeded in the spring, you know, probably in like 6 weeks or so now. Yeah, get all the weeds out, dump a whole bin without sorting any of the worms out, and they will, over the next couple of weeks, kind of bore that compost down into the soil. And then you can just rake it lightly and plant. So, you know, yeah, it's, if you want to save all your worms, you can go and pick through them. But I'd just as soon let them live a happy life and reproduce in my garden. That's more or less my setup. It's pretty simple. The last thing I'll plug that I think is really important to the way that I like to do things is to use waste products as much as possible. So newspaper is really cool. I've never had to buy any brown matter to put into a system. Takes a little planning, but certainly in Sackville and probably in other areas where people are in the fall. And then again in the spring, you'll see people putting bags of leaves to the curb. That's carbon that you can capture, that you can turn into humus and use in your garden. So, you know, if you have a vehicle or you have a friend that has a vehicle, go and fill that station wagon up with 4 or 5 bags of leaves. I find one big 50-gallon bag of leaves is enough to keep my compost nice and dry in a 20-gallon bin for a year. So about 1 bag of leaves per bin meets my needs. And in terms of mineral content, in terms of their ability to foster good like fungal cultures, leaves are the gold standard for building soil, and they're free.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Michael. That's great. I love this because everybody comes from such different like spaces and like does it so differently. And I think that's really great to have in a webinar like this. So Michelle, we didn't actually talk about your worm setup. So maybe what I'll do, is it okay if I share my screen and I'll find the greentools.ca, or do you want to talk a little bit about your system first?
I'll start talking and while you're bringing it up on your screen.
For sure.
Yeah. for home composting at home, worms make sense because it's so easy to do. And as John and Michael said, you don't need much. There are free materials out there. In Sackville, we have newspapers all over the place, like the Argosies that you can use. And so for my system, I wanted a system that I could move. And so I looked for one on wheels because I like to wheel it outside in the summer, the spring, when it warms up a bit more, and then in the fall, it would be moved into the house once it gets pretty cold. So yeah, this is my bin. So looking at all of the available systems out there, this was the one that was chosen. And so it's easy to move around the house. Right now it's in our garden room, and it's waiting to go outside. So for this system, so Lauren, can you move it down so we can see the picture? Yeah, yes. So he is the man in the picture. This is the same system as I have, except I use an IKEA bag to catch everything. One of those big, large IKEA bags catches what I need it to catch so it doesn't make a mess on my floor. And so you lift up the top, the bedding goes down, the soil, the peat, everything that you're putting in your bin. Same system as John has described. So the upper part is where they're actively eating, and then the castings drop. And so you can harvest the castings when you think your bin is full. And so I harvest usually about twice a year out of this thing, and I get approximately a full IKEA bag of castings that get put on my garden. So
Wow.
Yeah. So there's a little video here if you want to kind of see the process. He's opening the bottom and harvesting right now.
Yeah, do you want me to try and play that, Michelle?
Sure.
We'll see if that works.
Oh, there's no sound on the video.
Did you say there's no sound?
Yeah. Is there a way to share the sound?
I wonder if is there sound now? Like when I was,
Yeah.
no? No, yes? No sound? Well, maybe I'll just let it play anyways, if that's okay. And then we can still see a little bit, maybe, if he demonstrates.
Yeah, so this technology is from New Zealand. I wish that a Canadian company would kind of take the idea.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, just make it better and then capture it here.
That's right. Let's see if there's any more action shots. I guess he's just sort of showing.
Yeah, he's gonna undo the latch.
So is there, oh, I see, okay.
Yeah. And that's what he's got is castings. It all falls to the bottom. And there are no worms in it. The worms are up above eating. So those are pure. It's beautiful. The bin is, I mean, it's.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. Any other sort of components of it that you wanted to talk about, or should we go to questions?
Yeah, we can take questions. It's yeah.
For sure. I noticed that there's quite a few. So Anna was wondering, she said, if your bin is outside, how do you deter critters? She said that she had something chew into drainage holes.
so that the compost drain, the tea drains out the bottom. So there are holes in the bottom filter. So that's what gets caught by the IKEA bag.
Mm-hmm.
And the raccoons, we have quite a number in our neighborhood on Weldon Street. And so the raccoons have not figured it out yet. So far, so good. But I usually will stick a rock on the top and stick a rock in the bag so it doesn't blow away, because in Sackville we have so much wind.
Yeah, no, that makes sense for sure. Okay, so someone was wondering, so when you're harvesting castings, they wondered about the eggs, and I think they must mean like the worm eggs that are contained in the finished castings. So they wondered if you picked out the baby worm eggs or if you just wait for them to hatch. I don't know if anybody has any comments about that little baby worm.
I find with the setup I have, there are always very, very small little, look almost like little white hairs. Those are the baby worms. They won't hurt your house plants or anything else. They'll aerate the roots of your plants, and they'll grow up and be quite fine wherever you put the castings. From the setup I have.
For sure. I have a question. I think it's mostly for Michael, but maybe John as well. You can chime in. Someone was wondering about, because I know you mentioned, Michael, that you have like 5 bins, I think you said maybe going. So how does that work? Do you stagger which bin you put compost in? Is it sort of like one of them one week and the next week it's a different one? And sort of what's your system?
The system that I have used, and this started in an apartment where I was living with 6 people who were all maintaining the system together, is we made a little marker, as a little cartoon worm, to show where we had last fed, and kind of had a cycle going around. And I would find that with like a 20-gallon-ish bin, you can sort of divide it into 2 halves. I mean, maybe John was talking about using different corners or that kind of thing. But I would go for, put maybe a pound or 2 of matter on one side. The next time you feed, put it on the other side of a bin, rotate your way around. If by the time you get back to the beginning of your loop, you're finding that you still have a lot of not decomposed matter, then you need to either reduce the amount you're feeding or divide your bins up a little bit so that you have more capacity. But yeah, I mean, the real thing is listen to your worms, look at how quickly they're working through stuff. The speed at which they work through food depends on how well it's shredded. It depends on how many of them there are. It depends on moisture. It depends on temperature as well. So, I find even though I keep bins in the basement year round, they tend to go through things a lot more quickly in the summer than in the winter. But if you're finding after a week or 2, there are still, banana peels in your bin, which tend to break down pretty quickly, don't put more stuff in there. That's kind of the principle that guides the rotation. But I encourage people to, make mistakes and monitor their worms and sort of play it by ear, take some notes and learn what you can from your worms.
Great, thanks so much. Do you have any similar comments or different things that you found, John?
Pretty much the same thing. I was agreeing with Michael entirely. He goes to a bigger scale. We also use the black earth composters, the 80-gallon containers. We have 6 of the 80-gallon composters in our community garden that the community garden members use for making compost. And I have 12 of them at home. So I'm composting in a fairly big way outdoors and in a small way in my kitchen. So just my kitchen scraps go into the vermiculture, and I mostly have it as a demonstration so I can take to classrooms and set up for them and let them learn. But most of my composting is the outdoor compost.
So does that stay outdoors all year round then?
Yes. I've got composters now that are running around 110 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow.
Even when it's -5 degrees.
That's amazing.
The bacteria that you have 3 different types of bacteria that can work. You have the psychophils, the mesophils, and the thermophils. The thermophilic bacteria will heat up your compost as high as 140 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. You can even,
Wow.
one of the demonstrations I do for the kids at the youth center is in their composter when it's going well, I'll take an egg, put it in a Ziploc baggie, and while we're talking about composting, I'll bury it down into the hot compost, and about 10 or 15 minutes later, I'll pull it out, break open and eat a nice hard-boiled egg for them.
Oh my gosh.
They won't eat it because it comes out of this black looking compost, but if it's in the Ziploc bag, the egg is nice and clean and it's well cooked and it's very good. So
That's so funny.
Just to kick in on that, it should be noted that with those thermophilic or hot kinds of compost systems, worms do not like that stuff. That's a whole different kettle of
yeah,
fish.
that'll kill the worms.
If you get compost in your bin that, you know, because of what you're putting in there, you know, in a worm bin ends up being warm to the touch or close to your body temperature, that's going to lead to some pretty unhappy worms. So we're kind of looking at, I find like 15 Celsius to be about optimum. Any warmer or colder, you start to either have disease issues or the worms start to be a little less happy.
Good to know. Yeah, thanks, Michael, for that. Yeah, contrast for sure. There were some questions about compost tea. So someone near the beginning, John, was wondering about compost tea versus leachate. So they've heard that some people say they don't use the liquid, other people say they do use the liquid. They wondered if compost tea is the liquid that you would soak finished castings in. Don't know if you have any comments about that, anybody?
I do have a number of different comments about compost tea. Everything from, with the worms, the liquid that comes down below, you can also put some in a mesh bag and then soak it in a container of water and use the leachate that you would get from that as compost tea. It's still good for the plant. It keeps from adding the good organic matter that you have though, which is also good for the roots and for the plants and for maintaining the moisture level in the pot. I also find with the big outdoor composters that you can take the compost out of that and you can put it in a burlap bag and then you can drop it in your rain barrel. And then the rain barrel water is nicely enriched and you can use that to water your garden. And that really is great for the garden too.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That's cool. This question came up before and all three of you can answer if you want, but folks were wondering about where to get worms. I know Michael, so if you're in Sackville, New Brunswick, I know Michael can hook you up with worms. If you're in the St. Andrews area, I know John can hook you up with worms. Do you folks know, somebody's in Fredericton and they were wondering about worms. Anybody have
Yes,
any?
I had his card. I've gotten worms from him years ago, but I've always had a supply since, and I always give worms to people. I had seen his card in the bedroom this morning. I was going to bring it down for the stock, and I forgot, but he lists himself as the worm man in Fredericton.
Okay, so there's someone in Fredericton called the Worm Man who has worms. Okay.
And you can also get them on Amazon and other places. There's lots of places you can go to Google and they will ship them to you. They'll pay as much, you pay as much as $100 for a bag of red wigglers. They come in peat moss bagged up. They look a little dried out, but when you add them back to some nice compostable material in the soil, they come to life and they do a pretty good job. When I was in sort of teaching at the University of Florida and I didn't have my bin from here, then I got worms from an outfit in Texas who shipped them. So they're very easy to get online or from somebody else that's got some. Anybody that's got one in their kitchen can easily share their worms. So I'm always happy to share worms and can use the same technique and put them in a nice cloth bag with peat moss and ship them anywhere in New Brunswick.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so John's offering to ship them in New Brunswick. Someone just said they're in Bathurst and they have some worms to share.
Good.
Someone was wondering about Miramichi, but it sounds like you can contact John and he can ship you some worms. Michelle, do you know about any places to get worms? I think your worms came with your system. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. So I got the bin and the worms all in a package in a box.
Package deal. There we go.
You could use maritime bus to ship worms around New Brunswick.
Oh, there we go.
Then you don't have to pack them as well. They would get there the same day.
There we go. Perfect. And support the maritime bus for sure. Someone just asked in the comments about the cost of your system, Michelle, if you don't mind sharing that.
Yeah, so it was $300, but then shipping and worms, it came to something like $375.
Okay,
For
sure.
Yeah.
So sounds similar in price to the couple systems you shared at the end of your presentation, John, is
Yes,
that right?
except that I like hers better.
I like my
Fair enough.
too. It's clean. It's you can bring it in the house into a regular room in your house, but it's mostly outside in the garden.
For sure. Yeah. No, I think that's great. Someone was wondering about reproduction secrets. I guess getting your worms to reproduce. Is there a secret? Are they just going to do it on their own?
They're going to do it on their own. And when you harvest your worms, you'll quite often find that a couple copulating. Each worm is both male and female. So they're each mutually able to fertilize and produce. The little white ring you see on near the front of the worm is where the female part of the worm will lay the eggs. That little, she retains the eggs in that little white band around there until they get to the hatching stage. She'll drop that band off and the little worms will squirm around out from there. They're tiny, 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 about a millimeter or 2 millimeters long when they first hatch. And they grow fairly quickly, going through looking like a little tiny white hair up to, small worms. And that's never been a problem. Once you've got started with worms, you will have more worms.
Yeah, does Michael or Michelle, anybody have problems with worms reproducing? I feel like that's probably not an issue, right? Like.
So in my system, when they're outside and it's really cold, they don't reproduce as well as they would at an indoor temperature. But worms are self-regulating, and so they will reproduce up until the amount that really can survive in the bin. So they don't overproduce.
Perfect. Great. Someone had a question. They said, it's a funny image in my head. They said if they have a barrel like spinning composter, could they just throw their worms in there? Or is it better to have a specific worm bin? I can just picture like worms sort of flying out of the, anyway. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, one of the things when I was in Florida at the Extension Department, we had about 7 or 8 different kinds of composters on demonstration, including the rotating ones. They tend, when you're rotating and mixing and you're adding material, they tend to become thermophilic bacteria in there, and they will tend to destroy any worms that are in there. So that if you got the big rotating bin, and that tends to, because you're aerating it and getting lots of oxygen in there, the bacteria are going to work well. It tends not to be a good environment for the worms. But when you've got one of the black earth composters or whatever, and as the compost, it goes through a heat cycle, when it starts to cool down and it's nearly ready to harvest to go in your garden, it will be invaded by worms. They will eat up what's left in there and convert it into nice worm castings. And you're able, in one of these big 80-gallon composters, as it's ready to go in the garden, if you want to sort out and give worms to somebody that's going fishing, or you want to give worms from there to somebody else or put in their garden, you can easily harvest up to 10,000 worms out of an 80-gallon barrel.
Wow, that sounds like a lot of
But
worms.
they naturally, if you got it where it's open to the bottom, the worms are going to just come in when it's ready. Even the ones that I have now that are running warm but not extremely hot through the winter, I have worms that are in that compost as I turn it to keep it going. And then I'm seeing lots of worms coming up in that nice warm soil for the winter. Otherwise, they'll move down into the soil deep where it's not freezing and survive until the spring.
Gotcha. Has anyone who's gotten any worms recently or has done things with worms, does anyone have any like success stories or questions or anything like that? You can feel free to unmute and ask your question, or put your hand up. Someone was asking about pests in the worm bin, like mites or nematodes. They were wondering what to do if there's too many mites. I don't know if they have that problem now, or does anyone have experience with that? Any problems? Michael, I see you nodding.
Yeah, there's and I forget I don't know, I really like Latin names. I looked up the Latin name for these guys. I don't know what it is right now, but there's this kind of compost mite that I have dealt with time and again. They're a tiny arachnid. They're like about the size of the head of a pin. They look kind of round and they're a sort of beige color. They move very slowly. They look like little bubbles almost. And they are a species that thrives in the same conditions as compost worms, and they like the same kind of food. They break things down a little differently. They're a little better at like mechanical decomposition. So things like fruit pits, they love. They can compete with worms. And if you find that if you have a couple, you're finding in your bin, maybe a couple dozen, no big deal. If you find you have more of them than worms, what I recommend is dump your bin in the garden, like use it to grow plants in, and reculture some of those worms and start a new bin from scratch. There's not an awful lot you can do to kill mites that isn't going to kill your worms as well.
There's another critter that some of the people that have been vermiculturing have had, and it's called a springtail. It's a tiny little white, little smaller than a flea, and they tend to walk around. They're easy to squash, but they tend to multiply. And when you go towards them, they can jump about 10 times or 20 times their height in the air. That's why they're called springtails. They will also break down organic matter. They're not really harmful, and they seem to be quite compatible with the worms, but a number of people that have had the vermiculture and had those little critters show up have not liked them. And like Michael suggests, you can dump that in the garden and start with fresh worms. I also find that if I put fresh peat moss on the top and if the surface of the setup is dry, then the springtails tend to disappear, but the worms are still happy because they can come up, get a bit of peat moss and go back down again because they stay in the moist environment. So that when I've had springtails, I've gotten rid of them by just spreading a layer of peat moss on the top, the dried peat moss.
That's good to know, John. Michelle, have you had any issues with pests?
Yep, I've had an experience with springtails, and what John said is correct. It is to sprinkle peat moss. They don't like it, and they also don't like eggshells. So if these worms like the eggshells, springtails don't. So they tend to, on my composter, they collect along the side, on the green part of the composter. And so I just go and wipe them right off with toilet paper and flush them away. Say bye-bye. They're not a big deal. I mean, they look odd. If you're overrun with them, yeah, you should get on top of that. But they do break down food.
Okay, cool. So sounds like not a big deal. It's definitely something that's manageable. Yeah, John.
Our high school kids here in Dartmouth, or in St. Andrews, had some little ugly looking beetle. It had funny little claws that came out at the front of it, not quite like a crab, and it sort of took over their vermiculture, and they ended up sort of dumping that. And I don't think they're doing vermiculture now. They do have the green or the black bin composters outside, and they have the green dome digesters going, but I think they gave up on vermiculture because they didn't like this beetle. I figure it came from some fruit or vegetable that they added, as if there's something on the plant and you put it in there and it happens to enjoy the environment, they'll begin to survive there.
Gotcha. Well, we're getting close to 1 o'clock, so I think we'll probably wrap up. And I want to say, if there's questions in the chat that we didn't have a chance to get to, I can certainly pass them along to these folks, and they'll do their best to get back to you guys. If you're looking for worms, I know Michael can hook you up here in Sackville. I know John can hook you up in the St. Andrews area or can ship them to you. And so thank you so much, guys. Any last comments you wanted to say or anything we didn't get to? Feel free to bring it up now. But if not, thank you guys so much for attending the webinar, and I hope it was helpful information, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Yeah, I would just like to thank you, Lauren, for organizing this webinar and an opportunity to meet with all the other people who are here to learn a little bit about vermiculture. And Michelle and Michael, nice to see you.
Okay. Yes. Good to meet you, John.
No problem.
Gotta spread the worm love.
That's right. Exactly.
Good luck
All
out
right.
there.
All right. Thanks so much, guys. Take care. All right. Bye.